people like me. You need people like me so you can point your fingers and say, that's the bad guy. That's the bad guy. That's the bad guy. That's the bad guy. That's the bad guy.
Welcome to the motherfucking relay. We're covering today's top boxing news. Ow!
Okay, we'll start with this. On Friday, right before the big welterweight showdown between Spence and Terrence Crawford, we're going to get some minimum weight action. Friday, the night before, by way of Top Rank, Estrada will defend her WBA and WBC minimum weight titles against former IBF champion Leonela Paula Yudica. Sporting professional record of 19 wins with 1 loss and 3 draws. 1 knockout, only 1 recorded knockout. Leonela Paula Yudica is not the puncher that Estrada is. Nowhere near as offensively minded. Sinicia sports an unblemished record of 24 wins with no losses, no draws, 9 knockouts. Estrada, who is about 2 to 3 years younger than Leonela Paula Yudica, this will be Sinicia's 3rd fight in the last 12 months. She was in action in November of last year, in action again in March. Relatively quick turnaround for all of those fights, less than 6 months apiece. Less than 6 months in between fights. Her 3rd fight in the last 12 months, and what will be her 3rd fight under the Top Rank banner since having left Golden Boy Promotions for Top Rank and ESPN. Doing a fantastic job of keeping her active, keeping her busy, and building her brand. Though this is not exactly the fight that I expected her to have. I expected that Sinicia wouldn't have much luck getting Yo Costavalle in the ring. Yo Costavalle, the only other champion in the minimum weight division. I didn't think that fight would materialize, and it didn't. And what I expected was that Sinicia would subsequently move up, perhaps take on Jessica Niri Plata, unified champion north of minimum weight at light flyweight. There are only 2 champions there, both unified. I expected Sinicia to end up fighting one of them. This fight with Yudica, Leonela Paula Yudica, keeps her in the minimum weight division a while longer. And if she is victorious, if she is successful on Friday, perhaps they will revisit the Yo Costavalle fight one more time before making the decision to move up in weight. We'll see how that goes as far as this fight. And what I expect to see on Friday, well, Leonela Paula Yudica is a defensively minded fighter, a pure boxer, a counterpuncher, a moving target. Crafty and durable as Argentinian fighters come, though not offensively minded. She's a cerebral fighter, a pure boxer, a mover. Perhaps that's why she has so few knockouts. When you're on the move, when you're constantly boxing on your toes, you're not sitting on your punches, so you're not generating that much power. Even if it's off the counter, she's not a strong puncher, let alone as strong as Sinicia, who's going to likely put a lot of pressure on her. In Sinicia's last fight with Tina Ruprecht, you saw her take a more balanced approach. Knowing that she was in the ring with a smaller fighter than herself, Sinicia Estrada knew Tina Ruprecht is likely to give chase. You don't have to find her, she'll come to you. With Leonela Paula Yudica, it's the opposite. She's more likely to hang back, set traps, work off the counter, circle away, move lateral. Move and punch. Different fight from Sinicia's last fight, very different opponent. Thus, Sinicia will have to take a different approach. She'll be a lot more offensively minded, I think, in this fight. Leonela Paula Yudica looks a bit taller than Sinicia Estrada, a bit longer legs, longer strides. You will notice that torso doesn't move much, you know. Leonela Paula Yudica, she doesn't bend at the waist, bend at the knees, doesn't take a wide stance. That torso, that body, stay to be hit. Sinicia Estrada, already regularly going to the body, bit of an accomplished body puncher, and Leonela Paula Yudica's body being there so static. You know what they say about a moving target. You know what they say about a fighter's legs. If you want to take a fighter's legs away, you go to the body. I expect that while Sinicia is cutting off the ring and closing the distance on Leonela Paula Yudica, who's likely to be on the move because she can't match Sinicia's firepower, I expect that going to the body will be part of the strategy, part of the plan, to take those legs away. Slow Leonela Paula Yudica down, who I reiterate, she can't match Sinicia's firepower. She can't match her output. She's not an offensively minded fighter like that. She's a counterpuncher. She oftentimes lets the other fighter lead the dance and works off of what they throw to counter what they throw. You know. Leonela Paula Yudica, who used to reign as IBF champion 2 divisions north of minimum weight at flyweight, she's been making her way south since losing her title to Arely Musinho. Her last fight was at light flyweight, and her next fight is at minimum weight.
Quite the drop.
She's never been stopped before, you know. She's never been knocked out.
But I wonder what her punch resistance is going to be like campaigning 2 divisions south of where she used to reign as a champion.
She will be facing one of the stronger punchers, one of the strongest punchers anywhere at or around this weight. I mean, never mind the switch hitting and the little things. The foot speed and hand speed alone, the athleticism of Senicia Estrada, offensive whirlwind, will prove to be too much for Leonela Paula Yudica. So provided she doesn't get stopped,
right,
provided she doesn't get knocked out, at minimum, I have Senicia Estrada winning a points decision behind being the more prolific puncher, the busier puncher.
Busier fight by fight than Leonela Paula Yudica.
Too many tools in Senicia Estrada's toolbox to win this fight, and at minimum, I think she can win a points decision. So Senicia on points conservatively is who I'm going to go with. Men's welterweight news, unbeaten up-and-comer Stanionis has no problem with facing Ennis next, loathes tune-up fights on the heels of the Virgil Ortiz fight's collapse, and how much time both teams ended up wasting on that. You know, initially, it was Stanionis that had a medical issue, and then it was Virgil.
Nobody got nothing out of that situation.
Yes, said Stanionis when asked if he would face Ennis at the end of the year. I would fight anyone. I just want a good dance partner. Stanionis' Spartan-like mentality is appreciated, but that doesn't mean it would be a sagacious move. Since Stanionis has been forced to the sidelines, Ennis, 31-0 with 28 knockouts, has put together an active schedule, fighting a total of 3 times in that same span. Rust is beginning to build on Stanionis' skills. Ultimately, he admits that it would be discerning if he faced a much lesser name before jumping into the deep end. The only problem with that, however, is Stanionis loathes taking soft touches.
Well, he needs one.
You're hearing that more and more, fighters saying things like they don't want tune-up fights and they don't like tune-up fights, but those tune-up fights, they're more beneficial to the fighter than I think the fighters and their teams realize. Being a more active fighter means being on weight, or at least close to fight weight, more often than not. No long stretches in between fights.
No beer belly.
The weight's not as hard to make because you're always hovering at or around it. But if it's a year,
you've got a year or more in between fights. Well, making that weight, that just makes it harder to make.
Stanionis was quoted as saying, "Maybe it's not smart. I was off a long time. I just want to fight. I don't like tune-ups."
Now, here's the thing. You don't want to have too many lighted touches. You don't want to have too many tune-up fights. You want interesting dance partners in between the tune-up fights and the not-so-tune-up fights.
But essentially, you want to be active for the aforementioned reasons, that the more active a fighter is, the closer to fight weight.
Makes you sharper, too. A fighter, a more active fighter, is a sharp fighter.
So many fighters are in a perpetual state of preparation these days.
You wonder if that's not why so many of today's fighters seem more injury-prone than yesterday's fighters, who fought more often than these guys.
Repeat injuries, stress fractures, from being in that perpetual state of preparation as opposed to fighting under the hot lights more often, not having to boil down in weight because you're always close to it. And the added benefit of being more active is notoriety.
Fame.
People see you more, they talk about you more, and that allows you to amass marquee value. A fighter like Stanionis, let me tell you, there is not a large Lithuanian contingent, large enough.
He does not have a built-in fan base the same way that, say, a Mexican fighter would, or a Puerto Rican fighter.
In America, marketing a Lithuanian fighter, that's a tough ask. Most of all when the fighter has the personality of warm mayonnaise. So the best way to market the fighter is to showcase his skills, show people what he can do. And if you're not getting the chance to do that often enough, your guy's always going to fly under the radar because he ain't got a built-in fan base, and he ain't fighting enough.
Fat fucking chance you can get a Stanionis the kind of following in America that, say, Conor Benn has in the United Kingdom.
They've been talking about him. Some have been talking good, some have been talking bad, but they've all been talking. And that is more or less what you want, whereas a Stanionis is always going to seem like a background character to other more prominent and popular fighters.
Yeah.
Popular welterweights.
Right now, he just seems like a body to put in the ring with Jaron Boots Ennis, who's not Julio Iglesias per se, but he is a more talked about, a more well-known fighter than a Stanionis.
You think about Gennady Golovkin's rise to popularity. You know, there's not a large Kazakhstan contingent here in America, a large Kazakhstan community, at least one that rivals the Mexican boxing community, yet somehow he was able to become a household name, a popular fixture in the sport. And the way that he did that was fighting often enough that every
few months you see this guy and he's breaking somebody's nose, he's breaking somebody's face. That endears you to the fight fans, that endears you to the boxing community at large, the paying customers, and allows you to amass marquee value.
Now, in Emontis Stanionis' defense, the reason that we haven't seen him in such a long time is because he's been all entangled in this Virgil Ortiz fight that ended up not materializing. First, Emontis had a medical issue, and then Virgil had one. So you see where the time went, but his attitude towards tune-up fights is what needs to be addressed here, because he needs one, might need two.
Too many fighters in today's day and age are fighting once a year or twice a year. They think themselves celebrities. They think themselves stars.
Their star power pales in comparison to the star power of their predecessors, who were, in fact, more active, more often than they are now. You're only going to get so popular on a schedule like that. And a good number of these fighters, some haven't fought in the last 12 months. Jermall Charlo hasn't fought in the last 2 years.
How do you imagine that's helping his popularity?
Think about it. Jermall hasn't fought in 2 years. Jermell hasn't fought in 1. Neither has Errol Spence Jr.
Or Emontis Stanionis. When's the last time you saw Gary Russell in a fight?
Or Leo Santa Cruz. I mean, when's the last time you seen these guys? And it's not helping their situation that they're not fighting, but that's the situation.
Tune-up fights. Tune-up fights can be beneficial to a fighter, believe it or not. They can keep you sharp, keep you active, keep you talked about.
Granted that you don't want to go overboard with tune-up fights, build up a false sense of confidence, a false sense of security because you're always knocking over stiffs. You've got to mix in some interesting fights, interesting opponents in there. But the idea is to stay active, stay busy.
Yeah.
And too many of today's fighters are not.
Jaron Ennis is not the kind of guy that you take on when you've been inactive for over a year. I think that goes without saying.
And I already don't like Emontis Stanionis' chances against that particular fighter. Tack on the inactivity,
And it's slim pickings.
just in keeping with the theme of all things welterweight ahead of this Saturday's mega match, Crawford on Spence's size edge. I'm always the smaller guy. Bigger they is, the harder they fall.
Crawford's detractors, in reference to this fight, often bring up that Errol is the naturally bigger fighter. That doesn't necessarily translate into him being the stronger fighter, though, does it?
Now, don't worry about it, said Crawford during a virtual press conference on Wednesday. Listen,
Look.
when you talk about size, you talk about Jeff Horn. They said Jeff Horn was one of the biggest welterweights other than Spence. When you talk about size, you talk about Sean Porter. You know me, and Sean Porter was in the amateurs. I was at 132 when he was at 165.
One of the things I hate the most about the YTBC and just the boxing community as a whole, the boxing community at large.
You can take me at my word when I say that I remember, ahead of the Jeff Horn fight, a small contingent of individuals saying that Jeff would be too big and too strong for Terrence Crawford based on him bullying Manny Pacquiao around, making him look old, making him look his age at that time.
Terrence wasn't acclimated to welterweight. The Jeff Horn fight was set to be his very first fight at welterweight.
I remember that there were some individuals that were actually picking Jeff Horn to win that fight. I remember in the YTBC, the Facebook boxing groups, I'm sure that if you asked those same people here today who they picked to win that fight, they'd give you a different answer.
But I remember. And that's what I hate about some of these guys. They're so fucking dishonest.
You know, Jose Benavidez Jr., he was a big welterweight. I don't know. Like, I'm always fighting bigger welterweights, so that's nothing new. I'm always the smaller guy. Even when I was at 140, I was the smaller guy, you know, at 135. I might have been tall, but I was the smaller guy. So being the smaller guy, you know, never made me think, oh man, this guy's too big. It's cool. The bigger they are, the harder they fall.
Most people might forget that Victor Postol, even John Molina, these were taller, longer fighters than Terrence Crawford, but you never would have known it based on the beating that he put on those guys.
He's been the smaller fighter before. He's been the smaller fighter more than once, more than twice, more than thrice. And Crawford admits losing does cross his mind, but stays mentally strong to keep negative thoughts out.
He would have had to the last 5 years, as a large portion of the boxing community was belittling him and berating his accomplishments, berating his resume. You gotta have thick skin for that.
I trained too hard to think about losing, said Crawford on an episode of All Access. A part of me feels that in spite of both men working to make this fight a reality in what
seemed like the 13th hour,
Crawford wants it a little more than Spence does. Crawford's hungrier because Terrence Crawford, unlike Errol Spence Jr., He hasn't had the red carpet rolled out for him. He hasn't gotten all the plaudits.
For the last 4 or 5 years, he's basically been frozen out of the welterweight division, scratching and sniffing and searching out opponents wherever he could, and he was criticized for it.
Now fighting on the biggest stage that he's ever fought on, I happen to think he's hungrier than Errol is, saying, does it cross my mind? Yeah, it always crosses my mind. What if? But my mind is so strong that it keeps those negative thoughts out. The thought of losing.
Losing to Spence, losing to anyone.
More focused on beating Errol Spence Jr. than losing to him. In reference to that, Crawford says this is going to be the cherry on top of my career. There are still some who struggle with the idea that Terrence is already a very accomplished fighter.
Immediately dismissing that he was a champion at 135, a champion at 140, and not just a champion, a Ring Magazine and lineal champion. And they do this.
They don't want to acknowledge how dominant he was at those weights, because if they do, then they have to admit that he's already more accomplished than Errol.
This is just extra.
Errol Spence Jr. is not a 3-division champion or even a 2-division champion. He's never had the Ring Magazine title, never held the ring belt, never been lineal. It means everything, said Crawford during a recent presser. This is going to put the cherry on top of my career.
Thinking about Terrence Crawford's hunger ahead of this fight, that in beating Errol Spence Jr., he might finally get the credit he's been deprived of for so long.
And I'm not trying to convince you. I'm not trying to persuade you to pick Terrence Crawford to win the fight as opposed to Errol Spence. I can only tell you what I think, and if you want to know what I think, and you're here, so I'll assume that you do, a big part of the reason that I'm confident Terrence wins on Saturday is because he's a gym rat.
It's not just the fights, it's not just what happens under the hot lights, but what happens outside of the ring, outside of that.
I think Terrence Crawford over time has proven to take better care of his temple and his moneymakers than Errol Spence Jr. has, who seems to have been wrestling with an alcohol problem for some years. Lest we forget, that's how he ended up flipping that Ferrari.
I don't know how anybody could ignore that.
How many videos of Errol Spence Jr. under the influence, inebriated, have we talked about here on this channel over the years?
Just don't know how anybody could ignore that.
Or how even though Errol Spence Jr. is supposed to be the naturally bigger fighter, that doesn't necessarily translate into him being the stronger fighter, having campaigned as a welterweight for such a long time. I don't imagine making 147 has grown easier to make.
I imagine it's harder.
Aside from the resumes and the stylistic matchups, the propensity the fighters have and their temperance, which you're used to seeing them do, aside from that, there are those intangibles. You overstay your welcome.
Stay at a weight too long, it makes you weaker over time. You lose your sharpness, lose your explosivity.
I suspect that's already happened to Errol Spence Jr., and that's why he couldn't stop Mikey Garcia or Danny.
I don't think either of those two guys would go 12 rounds with Terrence Crawford. I think he'd stop them both.
I think making welterweight has weakened Errol over time, and yes, that matters. Forgive me for saying so, but that's important, that Terrence isn't the one that's been struggling to make welterweight.